I'm here today with Professor Sandy Darity. He's the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity and a professor of public policy, African American Studies, and economics at Duke University. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We live in a country that has founding documents, Declaration of Independence, Constitution, Bill of Rights, supposedly the land of opportunity. And in comparative sense, that may be true. But when something doesn't go right systematically, how we cope with it, how we address it, or how we deny it and avoid it is a persistent source of concern. And there's no place that I think where that concern is more troubling and persistent than with regard to African American people and their treatment.
Well, I mean, if we go back to the founding documents, their introduction was not something that occurred in an environment of purity.
That's right.
If we think carefully about the origins of the struggle for independence on the part of the 13 colonies, that struggle was deeply linked to the attempt to preserve the practice of slavery in the United States. And so the founding documents are documents that make or provide a declaration of liberty for a minority of the American population. And I say a minority because in a strict sense, the founding documents did not really include white women.
That's right.
But they definitely excluded black people collectively from the benefits and fruits of the formation of a new country. So, from the outset, we have a problem. And I would argue that exactly what you said remains a problem, which is the tendency to attribute existing ills, existing disparities, existing inequalities to the group that is subjected to those disparities and inequalities.
Yes.
So, the classic phrase that William Ryan introduced years ago was to describe this type of practice as blaming the victim.
Yes.
And this process of victimization decenters where the real factors are that are producing the kinds of inequalities that we observe. And so, yes, I mean, it's an ideological game that hides or disguises the real origins of these kinds of disparities.
And I remember Barbara Jean Fields writing about ideology and about how these masks are created to facilitate denial, and how you would say James Baldwin would speak about how these denials, these psychological structures of coping, harmed both black and white people.
Yeah.
Not equally. But to the detriment of both sides of the false resolution.
The reason why it harms both communities in general is because both communities are subjected to certain kinds of deprivations. It's not uniquely a black problem to be faced with uncertain income streams, uncertainty about how many hours of work you'll have, low levels of wealth and resources, the absence of adequate health insurance. Those are not uniquely black problems. They just are disproportionately falling more heavily on black folks. But to the extent that we blame the victims, then we don't provide solutions for the entire population to those kinds of issues.
Yes, and there's is captured in the phrase that Ta-Nehisi quotes in his recent book, and before that James Baldwin, those who would be white. They create a notion of a sanctuary where you're not subject in a fantasy life to those deprivations and the anxieties of the prospect of those deprivations.
Well, I think he calls them the dreamers.
Yes.
And he does that because they are constructing a fantasy.
Yes.
And that fantasy makes it extremely difficult for us to address our most pressing social problems.
Yes. Now, when we look at the evidence across the spectrum, education, health, employment, housing finance, ownership, entrepreneurship, we don't see something like traditional economic theory where you and I were educated, which is what I call a whiteboard and a just world outcome based only on your talent, your ability, your preparation, your stamina.
Right.
You see outcomes that are systematically detrimental
Yeah.
to the African American population.
You may have seen this report already that a team of us did, including Derek Hamilton at the New School, called "Umbrellas Don't Make It Rain."
Yes.
I think that report encapsulates the false narrative that has emerged out of much of traditional economics. Because one of the standard kinds of claims that emerges from traditional economics is the view that if we could improve the human capital of the group that has less, which usually means raising their educational attainment, then we can eliminate or close these kinds of gaps or disparities that we observe that are economic in character. But in Umbrellas Don't Make It Rain, we demonstrate, for example, that blacks who have completed a college degree have 2/3 of the net worth of whites who never finished high school.
Yes.
So it's transparent that additional education is not adequate to close the racial wealth gap. But moreover, if we compare blacks who have finished some college with whites who never finished high school, blacks who have finished some college have a higher unemployment rate than whites who dropped out of high school. And to compound that, if we look at unemployment rates at each level of education, blacks consistently have unemployment rates that are 2 times as high as whites. So there is not a payoff, an adequate payoff in terms of improved employment opportunities that's associated with additional education sufficient to close those gaps either. So these disparities have to be rooted in other kinds of practices, and I would say that one of the central ones is discrimination in employment. And then another major factor is the whole process of how we transfer wealth from one generation to the next through inheritances, through gifts and the like. Communities that have families that have more resources are better able to transfer those resources to the next generation. And this applies fully or strongly when we start thinking about racial inequality with respect to wealth, because black families on average have considerably less to be able to give to the next generation in the way of inheritances or gifts.
Or even to support education and experience in the formative years for that child.
That's correct. They do have less resources, but one of the ironies is black parents tend to actually use more of their more limited resources to support educational opportunities for their children than white parents do.
Yes.
So one of the examples that we've discovered in the work that we've been doing is the finding that indicates that black parents who have about $24,000 in net worth are more likely to provide some support for their kids' higher education than white parents who have about $84,000 in net worth. And so, this may be a consequence of the fact that black families perceive that educational attainment is the only avenue that will give them some significant improvement in life, whereas there may be a greater range of options for many white families in terms of what their kids might do.
They'd be less anxious.
They'd be less anxious
about that.
and that might explain it. But for anybody who subscribes to, again, a victim-blaming narrative that blacks are not committed to education and the like, that just doesn't seem to be borne out by the data. The classic comment that LBJ made when he finally managed to get the civil rights legislation through, that he said something to the effect that this is going to cost the Democratic Party the South for 2 or 3 generations. And it was a very prescient statement, because now the southern states are overwhelmingly committed to the Republican Party. And they are committed to the Republican Party in such a way that we have to interpret that kind of attachment as being deeply racialized. So I think that's exactly right, that there was an increasing reluctance to provide resources to communities that were predominantly black, public resources. And also that goes hand in hand with the process of so-called welfare reform,
Yes.
where the provision of welfare was identified exclusively with single black mothers, when
Welfare queens is
welfare
Ronald Reagan
queens was the
referred to.
phrase, and so that becomes a vehicle again for denying the provision of public support to those in need. So it is important how the crisis is framed, and the way in which the crisis is framed definitely has a role in terms of how we think about or how we construct policy solutions for those kinds of problems. And I think we've got to engage strongly in an intense act of reframing and getting closer to a picture that is consistent with actually what the evidence says.
Yes.
So that we can go back into the fray and actually make the right kinds of changes.
When we talking about evidence, when you talk with natural scientists, particularly biologists,
Yeah.
race is not a construct that's in their data. There are symptoms based on marriage patterns and other things of vulnerability to this disease or that thing, but by and large, in the natural science, they will tell you that race is a social construct.
By
and
and
it
large.
has a history, and it's well, I'm saying it's not unanimous.
No, it's not.
But it's a very strongly held result by ethical scientists that,
Sure.
that race is a social construct.
In biological anthropology and in
Yes.
and for most human geneticists, I think
That's
that's
right.
probably the case.
That's
but,
right.
But unfortunately, there seems to be a resurgence of an emphasis on notions of race as a biogenetic construct. There's a couple of examples, and they're related. One is the notion of race-specific diseases. So to the extent that one believes there are race-specific diseases, one must, I presume, believe that race is a biological construct. And then there's also this notion that there might be race-specific pharmaceutical therapies, drug therapies. And again, to the extent that one believes that, one must in some way think that race is a biogenetic construct. And so I think that there's been a tendency, particularly in the midst of the genomics revolution, for the idea that race is something that's biologically based to come creeping back into the discourse. So I think this is something that we also have to be very alert to, because I think it again is a detour, or it's a misleading way of thinking about it.
Absolving oneself of responsibility for the social construct.
Because if it's all in the genes, then what can we do about it, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about what you might call the data of outcomes related to education, health, and these other things, they're symptoms. They're not inevitable.
Right.
And how we address that, how do we address what you might call the policies that should be about universal humanity as opposed to otherness and segmentation? How do you envision overcoming that tendency towards division?
I think that it becomes important to be able to isolate and to examine in a careful way the experiences that people are actually having, whether they are black or white, the extent to which people are being subjected to deprivation or suffering, both physically and emotionally. I think this really comes to light in the context of the Great Recession, where the scope of the unemployment crisis was so large that there were significant numbers of white males who had professional positions who were cast out of work. And they frequently would not, they would frequently try to hide that. And they would also, to some extent, blame themselves, even though there were large numbers of people who were being cast out of work. So, I remember a personal friend who had lost his job, but he'd lost his job at a point in which 300 people were laid off from the same firm in the same day. But somehow he still had internalized this view that there was something he had not done adequately on the job that led him to lose it, when that was the farthest from the truth. And so I think that we've got to really examine what people are experiencing, and we've got to be able to now reassess what the reasons are why they have been exposed to these kinds of crises. The language that we increasingly are using from the perspective of this tradition that's evolving now that we call stratification economics is to emphasize the notion that the kinds of deprivations people encounter are a consequence of structural factors in our society. They're not attributable to individual dysfunction or individual deficiencies on average. Now, of course, there are some people who aren't very motivated, or there are some people who don't try hard.
Across the spectrum.
Across the spectrum. Yeah. And I'd have to say on some days, I personally don't try hard. There's some variation across us as individuals in terms of our motivation level, right? So, but in terms of that being an explanation for mass unemployment or for differences in outcomes across racial lines, it doesn't wash.
Thomas Sugrue has recently written a book about the persistence of segregation in the North. And at one level, his book suggests that the North plays innocent and points at the South. But these problems that relate deeply to real estate, education, and many other aspects of social design continue to plague us. And what's taking place in the North now that, how would I say, is hardening this segregation? Because it doesn't feel like we're softening the boundaries. It feels like things are getting a little bit worse.
I think if we looked at the historical perspective, we would, be even more disturbed, because I think what's happening in the north of the United States is really somewhat consistent with a long trajectory. So if we think about the South as the primary site for the practice of slavery in the United States, particularly with the production of cotton, we can't overlook the fact that there were strong linkages to overseas markets and to the financial sector that were based in a city like New York. Yep. Some people have argued that New York was a cotton city. And so there's a long history of Northern collaboration and complicity with the process of racial deprivation. And I think that in the aftermath of the Civil War, where the Civil War was the period in which large numbers of individuals in the northern United States actually did make tremendous sacrifices to eliminate slavery. In the aftermath of that, there was kind of I don't know what we might call it, Reconstruction exhaustion that set in. And at that point, the northern states distanced themselves from continuing to support the recently freed blacks. And that process continued until the adoption of the civil rights legislation in the mid-1960s. And it's in that period of time that you get a further intensification of patterns of residential segregation in the northern cities. I think what we're observing now in this process of continued urban segregation or urban residential segregation is really part of a longer trajectory that has a very extended history in this country.
When so much of the Caucasian population is in the low value-added sector, why do they continue to oppose policies that would put rungs in the ladder?
Yeah, so this is the classic question of why the white working class stays in the white coalition.
Yes.
This is a classic
Yes.
question.
Yes.
And my answer is, it is primarily because there's a comparison group which they are significantly better off than. So, for example, if you looked at blacks and whites who are in the lowest quintile of the income distribution, whites have about $15,000 in net worth, and blacks have about zero. If we were to compare the odds of coming out of an encounter with the police with your life in hands, it's much, much higher for somebody white, regardless of what their income level is.
Yeah.
So I think that if we start thinking about the comparative
relative,
position
yeah.
relative to blacks as a comparison group, that's what may explain why folks who are at the bottom end of the white distribution of economic outcomes may stay with the
They'll hang on
racial
to that.
coalition. Yeah.
Well, I very much admire the work that you've done for a long stretch. We talked earlier about seeing, when I was a young man, some of your papers at the Federal Reserve Working Paper Series.
We were both young men.
And, but in the work that you've done there and work with our group in Bellagio and your writings on stratification economics, I think, how do I say, you're one of those shoulders that's been at the wheel and at the forefront for a very long time at a very high level.
You're very kind.
Thanks for the work that you do, and thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Ralph.